Well, hello everyone. Glad to be back. I'm Kainiloa Chrisman, and today we're going to talk about Hawaiian gourds and how you would cut them, which sounds like a silly thing to talk about, but it's really pretty tricky. For one thing, the Hawaiian gourds were real hard and they were thin, and if you try to cut one on a slant like this, or even more of a slant like this one down here, it gets real tricky. So we've got modern tools. It's tricky even with modern tools, but I'll talk about the old tools too, because this is traditional Hawaiian culture channel, and that's what I'm trying to teach folks about, is putting ourselves back in the old times when they didn't have any metal tools. How did they do all these things? It's just astounding what they did. So what's called experimental archaeology is trying all the different things that were available in the old time culture to see how they work to do things that we know that they did. And one of the things they did a lot was to cut gourds to make things, because they had no pottery, as I've said before. So everything from birth to death involved gourds, probably more gourds in old-time Hawaiian culture than anywhere else on earth. And they had really, really fine gourds, thin-shelled, real hard, strong. So today we're going to talk about how to cut this one off to make a bowl like this. So how do you do that? How do you do that in the old times when you don't have a saw? Or a little one like this that's fragile? How do you do that? So this one is going to be all the more tricky because it had been left on the vine, and so it got a lot of mold and stuff on it as it dried out, shed its water, and got hard. And that makes it all mottled like this. When you harvest the gourd at the proper time and then you scrape the outer skin off so the moisture can come out, you'll get a beautiful gourd like this, where it doesn't have that mottling. And that's the result of scraping off the skin before it has the chance to do that, shedding the water and getting all the mold and fungus on it. But this one, trying to get some of this mottling off of here, I rubbed it a lot with 2-0 steel wool, and they had things like that in the old times. But that makes it all the more slick, and then we've got an angle, so trying to cut on here evenly is a real trick. So the first thing I'd say with you is that almost everybody nowadays is going to use some kind of modern saw to do this. Don't use power tools, because you're working with a fragile thing here, and as soon as you cut through it a little bit, the edge has all the more chance to give and crack. So you might have a beautiful gourd and you use a power tool and all of a sudden the saw sticks, or it takes a little turn to the side. Boom, you just wrecked your beautiful gourd. Or it veers off when you're not expecting it to. So you really got to stick with hand tools to do it right. If you're doing commercial things nowadays, sure, you've got all kinds of things set up in your bandsaw and so on. But if you're trying to learn how to do things the old way and also to develop some patience, which they sure had a lot of in the old days, you need to learn how to do things this way too. So I've got a bunch of things over here I'm going to talk about as possible tools to cut with. And this is a simple thing here. I've marked it with a pencil line here. So that's going to be just a simple cut around here, which I'm going to show you shortly. But what about something like this? This would have been what's called an ava strainer. It's a beverage amongst the Polynesians. And so they put a bunch of fiber in the neck here, mix up the ava with water in here, and then pour it into coconut cups. So this thing needs to be cut on a curve here. It needs to have the whole top cut out here. And this line just shows where the approximate water level would be when you finish it. And this one grew on the ground, so it's flat on the bottom. It's naturally flat on the bottom because it was heavy and grew on the ground, and it just grew that way. So I brought that one out just as an example, but let's look at some of these tools. So the modern tools, let's talk about that first. This is one of my favorites here. And that's just a drywall saw, but it's one that has real fine teeth, and it's got a good handle, and it's fairly strong, fairly straight, fairly strong. It's got to be straight, and it should have pretty fine teeth. It's, got enough toothiness here that it'll grab on the gourd and cut fairly readily, but it also has teeth close enough together that will hold its position as you run around a slick curved surface. But let's look at a couple other things too. These are Stanley saws. They're all over the place. They made tens of thousands of these things. and Stanley was a real well-known company. So each of these handles are essentially the same, but the blade is different. And so here's one that's got a little bit of curvature and fine teeth like a coarse hacksaw blade. That's a real good one. That's a real good one. But it needs to be, again, fairly stiff. This one's a little tricky because the blade flops around a little in the handle. But here's one that's made for drywall, and it has a point. Fairly stiff, fits real good in the standard Stanley handle, but you can use that point to turn like a drill and work your way through and make a little hole to start from if you needed to. So I like that one. And then here's another one, got a little bit more thickness to the blade out here and a little bit finer teeth. So that's a real good one too for working on ipu. I've found, ipu is a name for gourd in Hawaii. But I've found the different fineness of the teeth is important in what you're trying to do. And so gradually you just get used to what works out the best. And what's worked out the best for me, like I said, is that one. It's got the medium kind of teeth, not too fine and not too coarse, and a good handle to hold on to, and that one has been a real good one for me. So we'll see pretty soon how to do that. But what about in the old times? They had the shark's tooth knives, so that's a good thing to work with. But you can't twist with a shark's tooth knife, but just to start your line, it would work pretty well, but astoundingly, the gourds are hard enough that they'll pretty soon begin to wear the point off on a shark's tooth. My wife and a friend of hers were using one of my shark's tooth knives at a cultural event and wore the end clear off of a big maple shark's tooth. So here's another one. That's a piece of obsidian, small piece of obsidian that I've set into a bird bone. You know, they had glues in the old times. Set into a bird bone to make a tool. So if I use the corner of that obsidian, which is just black volcanic glass, I'd be able to scratch the surface of the gourd and at least give a start to get my line even all the way around to make a cut. There's another possibility, I doubt it, but that's a stingray barb. And I've used that a lot, even on some real hard wood, and these little fine teeth on here have held up pretty well. So again, just at least for starting the cut, yeah, that's a possibility. That's a possibility, a stingray barb. Then they had many things like this. This is basalt, the typical stone that they used for all sorts of things in Hawaii. They didn't have any flint, very little obsidian. But a piece of basalt that forms an edge like this, especially if it's slightly irregular, then becomes a saw. So you can use that as a saw. But it's a little coarse, a little hard to work with. Deepening the cut, yeah, it would be good for that. So a little piece of basalt like that broke to a real fine knife edge and maybe a little burr on it here, that would be real good because you can hold it between your thumb and forefinger and you've got real good control of that. Scratch, 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 trying to start your line. Then you have to deepen it enough that you can cut the top off. Another thing was the umeke shell. This is just a little one. But these shells live on the rocks and the boulders where the surf crashes and stick themselves to the boulder, and they're great to eat. So they were eaten by the millions in old times by Hawaiians. But some of them have real coarse edges, real toothed edges, and they make a pretty good saw. So I suspect that that was a distinct possibility for cutting gourds in the old times, was using one of the umeke shells that has a rough edge. That's a coral file. We talked about that in other videos before. Just taking a piece of white coral and rubbing it on lava until it gets to be an edge like that. So that's pretty good, but it's pretty coarse. You know, it would make a pretty wide groove pretty quickly. I think it might, it's rough enough, it might be a good way to start the cut. And then here is another one, and that's the one right there. See all those little teeth? That's the jaw of an ono, which in English terms is a wahoo. It's a long predatory fish. And it has all these little teeth like this, and a part of the jaw, this one's kind of curved, but part of the jaw, it's really straight. And it makes a good saw. So a friend of mine in a little shelter cave one time found one of these jaws fixed to a wooden handle that was almost completely rotted away. So obviously it had been made into a tool, and that's what gave me that idea. So it takes about a 20-pound ono to get this, but my wife took one of these and cut the top off of a gourd with a piece of the jaw from the ono fish. And the one thing else I wanted to show you was, what do you do when you get done? You know, if you want to smooth out the hole, if you made a hole in the top of a gourd like the one I showed earlier, these little shells like this, that are rough all over the outside, are just like a rasp. So you can put those in a hole and turn them, they'll round the hole right out, or you could put it in the neck of a gourd and rub it like that and smooth out and bevel out the hole that you had made, or smoothing around the edge if you cut the gourd like that. So let's start in with how we're going to cut this gourd. And what I do is use all four hands, because most people today think we got two hands. No, we got four hands. Four hands, 2 feet and 2 hands. And in the old days they weren't wearing shoes, so they used their hands and feet both all the time. And I do that too if I'm making cordage and things. So in this case I'm using my legs, and if I didn't have jeans on, my legs being maybe a little sweaty and tacky would probably hold this all the better. But you've got to have some way to hold this so that it doesn't slip. And then you've got to be able to turn it, and that takes your other hand. So it's got to stay kind of in a cradle like this while you turn it a little bit at a time. So you've got to get good light, and you've got to get your line and start rubbing right on the line. This one I'm going to rub just under the line so I can see it in this light. So now I've got a little cut started, and I'm going to turn. And see my arm here? It's locked against my side, so I can move my hand just like a little machine. Instead of not like this. Hold it like this. Get your hand tightly on there, and then you can move it evenly. Then I can watch that spot real closely, and I can see exactly where it's cutting. And this little machine just keeps cutting while I turn the gourd. I don't move the saw, I move the gourd. And right now I'm trying to cut just enough as I move along to make a groove. I'm not trying to cut through in any given spot. I'm trying to make a little groove evenly all around exactly where my line is. Trying not to let it slip. So this has to stay at the same angle in relation to the gourd all the time, straight toward the cut. Now it's just slipped, and that's because there's a little low place right here in the gourd. So I'm going to have to cut a little deeper as I approach that spot, or I'm just going to slip again. I'm always watching the line in relation to my blade to see if I'm heading perfectly along it. Now I got past that low place. Just had to cut it a little deeper just before I got to it. So you probably can't see it here in the video, but I'm constantly moving the gourd that way, just a little at a time, while I continue to just move the blade like a little machine. You can hear a different sound because I've hit a high spot there, and it's making a little bit different sound. So the gourd might actually have a softer or harder spot right there. Probably not. This would be a spot where a real fine blade would be better. This one's a little too coarse for that spot, and that's why it's making that scratchy noise. Now I got past it. You can tell by the sound that I got past it. Now we got another little low spot. We're still going. So bear with me. Now it slipped again. So that means I'm a little offline. because I'm hitting little overly slick places or little low places that allows the blade to slip. And you notice how I've got my finger here? That way I can keep the blade from going this way and kind of use it as a brace to keep it cutting where I want it to cut. Can you hear the difference in the sound when I hit those harder spots? You can tell from the sound what the shell is like in any given place. Okay, so now I think you've got the idea. And if you could see it real closely, you'd be able to see that I've cut a real good groove that's just barely underneath my pencil line. And I see over here I wound it off just a little bit. And the reason for that is gourds are not evenly round. They're not made on a potter's wheel, so they have irregularities. This side is a little more sloped than that side is, and so that makes a difference in trying to cut right along your line, not have the blade veer off due to the angle. So I'm correcting my cut here a little bit. Hear the difference in the sound? I want another high spot. Okay, so now instead of going all the way around, I'm going to show you what I would do, and this is not what I would usually do because it'll make this side weak while I'm trying to cut the other side. But I think this gourd is hard enough to handle this. So once you've got the groove all the way around, just cut it a little bit, but just enough to hold the blade. Then you start cutting a little deeper and a little deeper. Just keep following the line along. You hear the difference in the sound? That's different areas of structural change in the gourd shell. So some places the saw will just bite right in, and other places it wants to slide. So just bear with me a minute here and we'll get through this part. So what I'm doing now is I'm deepening it a little at a time. I don't want to go through. If I was doing this properly, I would go all the way around over and over until I finally get through. And then there's no chance of excess stress on one spot where the shell might crack. I can tell from this gourd how it's cutting pretty easily once I get through the hard outside edge surface. It's cutting pretty easily. And what that tells me is this gourd was a little bit immature when it was harvested. This shell is not as hard as it could get, or it wouldn't cut this easily. So it's good for our demonstration, though, because I'm going right through it here in a hurry. Now watch what happens. Just as if I was going around and around and around, if you can imagine that, cutting a little deeper and a little deeper and a little deeper. And eventually, as you go around and around and around, you get through. So we're doing this, as I say, just in one spot. And ordinarily I would not do that because it makes a weak place. But for purposes of the video, and there it went. Now it's through, you see. And I can tell, one, it's thin. The gourd is real thin. But now, see, it's flexible here. That's the problem. You really need to do this all the way around and just keep working your way around. And that's how you get a cut gourd that has an even top and isn't broken. So this one is a little thicker and harder. I know this one's going to be a little problematic because it's pretty thin and it's not as hard as it would be if it was a fully mature gourd. So the Hawaiian gourds, this is one. This is my own gourd that I grew in Hawaii. This is a true Hawaiian gourd, so is that one. But this one looks like it's really thick up here. And that's simply because the part right at the top where the stem is all solid. You have to work through that. It's difficult to work through that if you just want a small hole. And that's why it looks thicker. But the shell down in here will probably be about that thick. Maybe 3/16 of an inch, maybe 1/4 inch at the most. Whereas many of the gourds that come from the mainland suppliers were developed and are grown for crafting. So they want nice, thick gourds that they can work with that don't crack easily. You make birdhouses and all sorts of things with them. But the Hawaiian gourds tended to be real thin and therefore lightweight, real hard and real strong because they'd bred so many of them for centuries, and they just had superb gourds. So this one, I suspect, just from the feel of it and the weight of it, it's going to be a really good, strong, hard gourd. This one's going to be a little tricky. So what do you do if it's kind of weak? You can put some coating inside. I've only seen one old one that was coated inside using some kind of gum and elia. That's a sort of an iron-bearing compound, and it was used for pigments, paints, and in dyes and things like that. But it had some kind of glue plus powdered elia in it, and the whole inside was coated in red that way, which almost certainly indicates that it was something that was made for a chief. So they could have done the same thing. If a gourd was weak on the inside, they could coat it inside with the glues and gums that they had. That wouldn't work very well for cooking, of course, because it would get carried away by the cooking and the boiling. But if you were using it as a utilitarian bowl like this, it would make it stronger. And then we'll see in some other video how they'd sew them up sometimes if they cracked. That's a really remarkable thing. So that's a story on ipus and how you work with them. And I hope you learned something. See you next time.